Okay, simple summary for this week. The topic of this module is civil rights, and you've read a bit about that, or at least you will in your Connect assignment. Um, I want to talk about a specific event, and I don't think it epitomizes the civil rights movement, because that has to be, if you're going to epitomize something, if you're going to characterize it and define it, it would be the actions of people like Dr. Martin Luther King and Roy Wilkins and just all of the people who, in the African American community, who worked tirelessly for decades, and in Dr. King's life circumstance gave his life for the cause of civil rights. But the story I want to tell you is how civil rights became law, or at least a major milestone in it becoming law. Because you can have the support of the people, and you can have a dedicated group of volunteers, and they can peacefully demonstrate and organize and protest and have sit-ins and meetings and marches. But the way change actually happens is when you change the laws, in which change occurs when the government is on the side of the people seeking change. And for a black person in America, that had not really ever been the case. From our founding, our first president, George Washington, was a slave owner, 2 out of the first 3, he and Jefferson both. I don't find very much mention of civil rights in the 1800s. It wasn't an issue that predominated people's minds, except of course for the people who didn't have them. The issue of slavery, which is of course related, was dominant in the 1800s. But even once slavery was done away with, it didn't mean equality for people of color. And in the 1960s, you're talking about almost 100 years after the Civil War, there were people in this country who did not have basic civil rights. You couldn't go to walk into a coffee shop and sit down at the counter and sit where you wanted. You couldn't get on a bus and sit where you wanted if you were a certain color. You couldn't use any restroom in a public place. There were just basic things. Now, the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, the Civil Rights Law of 1964, relieved some of those concerns. But the most important thing to people of color in America in the 1960s in terms of getting their rights was their ability to vote. And in the South, it was very, very difficult on purpose for black people to vote. They were denied the ability to register. Sometimes it would be blunt and just no, and sometimes it would be cutesy little games like, oh, we're closed, sorry, or just they would have some random test that nobody in the world could pass. There was a concerted effort among the people who ran the government in southern states in the 1950s and before to prevent black Americans from being able to vote. And that was really the key in terms of sort of pushing open the gates and welcoming everybody into freedom. President Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, and at the time there was no civil rights law, at least not anything that was consequential. President Johnson in 1964 was able to persuade the Congress through a lot of pressure to pass the Civil Rights Act of 64, and that went to all that discriminatory practices in public places and things like that, but it didn't touch the vote. And so even though he had passed that bill, or persuaded Congress to pass that bill, and he had signed it, people were still protesting outside the White House in the spring of 1965. And it was because the people in the civil rights movement, and really the people against the civil rights movement, understood that the vote was the key, that if everybody can vote, then everybody has a voice, and that should naturally lead to more equality. And even among the people who were against civil rights for Black Americans, how can I put this? Even some of the people who you would consider to be some of the more severe racists, even those people would quietly admit it's not great to take away someone's right to vote, right? So I think the time was right for this, but people did not necessarily think it was going to happen. Keep in mind, Johnson was a Texan. Johnson walked around in his cowboy boots and had that thick accent. He did not look like a civil rights or sound like a civil rights crusader. And he had a long history as a senator and congressman in Texas of voting against civil rights. And so people, even after he had passed the bill in '64, were like, no about this guy. And so that's why the protesters were outside the White House. And they were singing. They were peaceful protesters. What they would do is they would sing an old Black spiritual song called "We Shall Overcome." And what they were saying is, obviously, they were going to overcome the racism that had held them back. And this was the song of the oppressed people of America. We shall overcome. And they would chant this thing. I'm not going to sing it, but they would chant this song when marching peacefully or at a sit-in or at a demonstration. It was sang frequently in Black churches all over the country, especially the South. And so President Johnson was scheduled to give a speech to Congress, and he was still working on the speech that night. And the limousines were outside the White House waiting for him, and the protesters were still outside the gates of the White House singing "We Shall Overcome" and just, holding up their placards and whatever it is you do in a protest. And Johnson got in the car and was driven down Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House to the Capitol. And he did not react. He did not say anything. He didn't roll the window down and yell at anybody. He didn't say a word. But he heard those protests. He definitely heard them. He knew they were there, and he knew why they were there, and he knew that they didn't trust him. So he goes to Congress, and he's introduced. The big fancy thing where everyone's assembled. All the House and the Senate is there, and the Supreme Court is there, and all these dignitaries are there, and the Sergeant at Arms calls, "Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States," and he comes down the center aisle, and there's applause, and he gives the speech. And I don't want to say it was an ordinary speech at all. It was actually a very good speech from someone who traditionally was not all that great a speaker. But in that instance, he began to talk about the need for Congress to pass a voting rights bill. And he said something like, it's been 100 years since Lincoln freed the slaves. It's been 100 years that we've been doing this. It's well past time to write this in the books of law. And we have a lot of work to do in this country to overcome the stain of racism. And we shall overcome. Think about that. That was the moment in which all of the people in the civil rights movement realized that the government of the United States was finally on their side in this fight. The President of the United States said, "We shall overcome," and adopted the motto of the people who had been outside protesting an hour earlier. And if you doubt that had any effect on people, I want to tell you two things. The first is that Dr. King was watching that speech on television and surrounded by a number of people who worked with him in the civil rights movement, all of these people deeply committed to the issue. And one of them looked over at Dr. King when Johnson said those words, and you could see the tears streaming down Dr. King's face. It was that impactful. And the other thing is, Johnson finished his speech, and there was polite applause, and he shook hands, and he made his way whatever, back to the limousine eventually to be driven back to the White House. And when that limousine drove up on that night, the protesters were gone. People understood what Johnson was going to do, and there really wasn't any more doubt about it. And not terribly long afterwards, Congress, bowing to the pressure that Johnson had put on them, passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And so to this day, I mean, it has been a little bit limited by some Supreme Court decisions in the last 10 years, but that was a milestone. That was the game changer, because at that point, as an American citizen, didn't matter what color you were, you could vote. Okay, that's your simple summary for this week. Write it up in your own words, write it in a Word document, recount as much detail as you possibly can.